Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
This time, we're headed to a place that's practically a legend in the world of haunted locations, Waverly Hills Sanatorium.
Yeah, Waverly Hills, it definitely has a reputation.
And you know, our listeners love a good ghost story, but we always like to dig deeper, separate fact from fiction.
Exactly. Uncover the history that might explain why these places become so shrouded in spooky tales.
Right. So with Waverly Hills, I think we need to start with the context. We're talking early 20th century America, a time when tuberculosis was this terrifying, deadly disease.
It was called the White Death, and for good reason. There was no cure, and it was ravaging communities.
Imagine that fear. Knowing there was no effective treatment, it must have been like living in a constant state of dread.
Absolutely. And that fear, that desperation, it fueled a lot of the practices we associate with sanatoriums. Isolation, fresh air treatments. They were grasping at anything that might offer a chance of survival.
And that's where Waverly Hills comes in.
Right. Louisville, where Waverly Hills is located, had a particularly high death rate from tuberculosis. So the need for a facility like this was really urgent.
So they built this massive state-of-the-art sanatorium, designed specifically to combat this disease.
It opened in 1926, and there was a lot of optimism surrounding it. This cutting-edge design, the focus on fresh air and isolation, it was seen as a beacon of hope.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? A place built on hope, now known for being so haunted and unsettling.
Well, the reality of Waverly Hills quickly became much grimmer than those initial hopes. The success rates were limited, and a lot of people died there.
Yeah, I've heard all sorts of exaggerated numbers thrown around about Waverly Hills. Tens of thousands of deaths.
That's not accurate. The actual number, based on records, is closer to 6,000.
Still, 6,000 deaths? That's a lot of loss. It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of number.
It's a heavy weight, that kind of collective suffering. And I think that's part of what contributes to the atmosphere at Waverly Hills today.
Right. It's not just about ghosts and spooky stories. It's about real human suffering on a massive scale.
Absolutely.
And speaking of grim realities, some of the treatments used at Waverly Hills, they were pretty unsettling, even for the time.
Oh yeah, some of them were quite radical, and definitely would be considered unethical by today's standards.
Like the body shoot. What was that all about?
Well, they needed a way to remove the bodies of patients who died, and they didn't want to demoralize the other patients.
So to keep morale up, they secretly sent bodies down a chute.
It sounds pretty horrific now, but at the time they thought it was the best way to handle the situation. They even built a tunnel to transport the bodies discreetly down the hill.
Wow, that's just chilling.
Yeah.
The lengths they went to hide the reality of death from those still fighting for their lives.
And the body shoot wasn't the only unsettling treatment. They did lung collapse surgeries, intentionally collapsing a lung to try and stop the spread of infection.
Collapsing a lung, that sounds terrifying.
It was risky, but it was one of the few options they had. And they also used ultraviolet light therapy, exposing patients' lungs to UV light to try to kill the bacteria.
They were really experimenting, trying anything they could think of to combat this disease.
It was a time of desperation for sure. They were searching for any possible solution to this public health crisis.
And all of that, those struggles, those experiments, that's all part of the story of Waverly Hills.
It adds another layer to this complex, unsettling narrative, a reminder of the very human struggles that unfolded within those walls.
Right, and eventually new treatments for tuberculosis were developed, and the need for sanatoriums like Waverly Hills started to fade.
In 1961, Waverly Hills closed its doors as a tuberculosis sanatorium. But the story doesn't end there. Just a year later, it reopened as a geriatric facility.
A nursing home. In the same building.
Yes, it was called Woodhaven Geriatric Sanitarium. And with this transition, well, a different kind of darkness began to emerge at Waverly Hills.
Interesting. So we're moving from the tragedy of disease to something else.
It's a shift from the suffering of a physical ailment to something perhaps even more insidious, the potential for neglect, for mistreatment, a different kind of shadow falling over Waverly Hills.
It's like the building itself couldn't escape its past. Even with a new purpose, this darkness lingered.
It's a really interesting point. This transition from a place of healing, however unsuccessful, to a place with allegations of mistreatment. It really adds to that unsettling feeling Waverly Hills evokes.
And there were confirmed instances of mistreatment at Woodhaven, right?
Sadly, yes. Claims of abuse, the use of electroshock therapy, it really paints a dark picture.
So you've got this history of death and suffering from the tuberculosis era, then the transition to a nursing home with its own disturbing issues. And then, to top it off, Wood even closes in the 1980s, leaving the building abandoned and vulnerable to neglect and vandalism. It's like the perfect setup for a haunted location.
You're absolutely right. That period of neglect is when Waverly Hills really became a local legend, a place for ghost hunters and thrill seekers. It's like these abandoned places, especially ones with a history like Waverly Hills, they just draw us in.
It's like we're trying to make sense of the suffering that happened there, trying to connect with the past.
And those who believe in the paranormal, they're looking for evidence, for contact with the other side.
Right. It's a mix of morbid curiosity and this desire for answers, all wrapped up in this creepy, atmospheric location. And speaking of atmosphere, Waverly Hills has no shortage of ghost stories. The girl in the solarium, the boy with the ball, the phantom hearse, you name it. It's like every corner has its own spooky tale. But are these stories, these legends, just our imaginations running wild in a creepy setting?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The power of suggestion is certainly a factor. When a place gets a reputation for being haunted, people tend to see and hear what they expect. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But even if we acknowledge that, some accounts, some experiences, they're harder to just dismiss as imagination.
True. And that leads us to one of the most infamous stories associated with Waverly Hills, the story of Room 502.
Room 502. I've heard some chilling tales about that room.
It's become a central part of the Waverly Hills legend, a focal point for a lot of the paranormal activity reported there.
There are a couple of main stories, right? About the nurses who allegedly died in that room.
Right. The first story involves a nurse who supposedly hung herself in the room back in 1928. And then a few years later, in 1932, another nurse is said to have jumped from the roof patio outside the room.
Both incredibly tragic and unsettling stories. And they really feed into that perception of Waverly Hills as a place marked by despair.
They do, but like a lot of these stories that get passed down, they've become a bit distorted over time.
And you've actually highlighted some inconsistencies in these accounts.
Well, there are some details that don't quite add up. For example, with the first nurse, there's no physical evidence to support the claim that she hung herself. And the alleged confirmation from a former staff member, it doesn't line up with the timeline.
So it becomes this puzzle, trying to sort out what might be true and what might be exaggeration or fabrication. But there's still that part of us that wants to believe, that wants to think there's some truth to these stories.
It's the allure of the unknown, the mystery. We're drawn to these questions, to the possibility that there might be more to reality than we can see or explain.
And speaking of the unexplained, our source material includes a personal anecdote, a pretty chilling encounter on the 4th floor of Waverly Hills.
The 4th floor, which was supposedly locked at the time.
That's right. Our source describes hearing slamming doors coming from that area, even though it was supposed to be inaccessible.
And then they saw something.
A shadowy figure crossing a doorway. It's like something out of a horror movie.
It definitely sounds unsettling. Of course, in an old building, slamming doors could have any number of explanations. But a full-on apparition, that's harder to explain away.
It's interesting, even you, with your analytical approach to these things, you don't seem to want to completely dismiss this experience.
I think it's important to respect personal experiences, even if we can't explain them. Dismissing them outright can be dismissive of the individual and their perception of what happened. What we can do is explore possible explanations, consider psychological factors, and leave room for the possibility of the unexplained, while still being grounded in critical thinking.
So what's the verdict on Waverly Hills? Is it truly haunted, or are we just projecting our fears and fascination with the unknown onto this place steeped in tragedy and decay?
It's a question that has fascinated people for decades, and there's no easy answer. Maybe it's a bit of both. Humans are drawn to patterns, to explanations. When we're faced with something we can't explain, it's natural to turn to the supernatural.
But even if we strip away the ghost stories, the factual history of Waverly Hills is pretty compelling on its own.
Absolutely. The desperation surrounding tuberculosis, the experimental treatments, the sheer scale of suffering that happened there. It's a stark reminder of a time when disease had a much stronger grip on humanity.
And Waverly Hills stands as a physical representation of that era. A monument to both the hope and the despair surrounding the fight against tuberculosis. It makes you think, what stories would the walls of Waverly Hills tell if they could talk?
It's an intriguing thought. I imagine those stories are still there, woven into the very fabric of the building. The rusted medical equipment, the peeling paint, the echoing silence of the empty rooms. And maybe, for those who are sensitive to it, those stories are present in the shadows, the unexplained noises, that feeling of not being alone.
So why are we so fascinated by places like Waverly Hills? Why do we seek out the darkness, the unknown, the potentially dangerous?
It's a complex question. On one hand, there's the thrill of it, the adrenaline rush of confronting our fears. It's a safe way to explore the darker side of human experience.
A controlled dose of fear.
Exactly. But on a deeper level, I think we're drawn to these places because they tap into our primal fears, our fascination with death, with the unknown. We want to understand what lies beyond, what happens after we die.
And places like Waverly Hills, with their tangible connection to both life and death, they offer us a glimpse into that unknown.
They make us confront our own mortality and grapple with those big questions that have haunted humanity for centuries.
It's like a journey into the heart of darkness and back again. And maybe in the process, we learn something about ourselves, about our capacity for fear, for wonder, and for searching for meaning in a world that often feels meaningless. It's easy to get lost in the ghost stories and the spooky atmosphere, but we can't forget the real human stories at Waverly Hills. The patients, the staff, those who lived and died there. Their experiences are just as important as any ghost story.
I completely agree. Beyond the paranormal speculation, there were real people who suffered and hoped and fought for their lives. Their stories deserve to be heard and remembered.
When we think about haunted locations, we often think about ghosts, but we forget these places were filled with living people. Waverly Hills was a microcosm of society. People from all walks of life, all connected by this struggle against tuberculosis.
And it wasn't just the patients, the doctors, nurses, and staff. They saw so much suffering and loss every single day.
It's hard to imagine what that must have been like.
It must have taken such an emotional toll, and yet they kept going. They wanted to heal, to comfort, to find a cure.
Their dedication is incredible, their resilience in the face of so much death.
It's a testament to the human spirit. Even in those dark places, even surrounded by death, there's still compassion and hope. Maybe that's why Waverly Hills is so fascinating. It reminds us that we're vulnerable and mortal, but it also shows us how resilient the human spirit can be.
It's like Waverly Hills shows us the best and worst of humanity, the suffering and fear and desperation, but also the courage and compassion, the constant search for a solution.
And those themes, those human experiences, that's what really stays with us even decades later. Whether you believe in ghosts or just love a good mystery, Waverly Hills connects us to a past that still influences us today.
So as we finish up this deep dive into Waverly Hills, I think it's safe to say it's more than just ghost stories and creepy tourism.
It's a historical landmark. It reminds us of a time gone by. It's a symbol of how strong the human spirit can be.
If you're listening and want to learn more about Waverly Hills, there's so much out there. You could read about tuberculosis and the people who lived and worked there. You could even visit.
You might even have an experience that changes how you see things, or hear something from the past that sends chills down your spine. But even if you never go there, the stories and the history, the mystery of Waverly Hills, it stays with you. It makes you think about life and death and how strong we can be.
Waverly Hills is a haunting reminder. Even when things are dark and we feel despair, there's always hope. It shows us just how strong the human spirit can be. We may never know for sure if it's haunted, but one thing's certain. Waverly Hills will always have a hold on us. Its history is chilling, its stories unsettling. And that lingering question, what really exists beyond what we can understand, that's what keeps us coming back for more.